Good evening. I'm George Kane, the Secretary of Minnesota Atheists. Tonight, I'm going to be discussing the question of whether there can be an objective basis for moral decision-making. It's an elementary premise of ethics that you cannot derive an ought statement from is statements. That is, you cannot derive a statement of obligation from conditions of fact alone. There are certain minor exceptions. For example, if I say, I owe $10 for this morning's meal, one can conclude that I ought to pay $10, that I have an obligation to pay $10. But this is a trivial case in which the obligation is contained within the statement of fact itself. But usually, we can only perceive a moral condition when we have not only conditions of fact, but also values. We cannot conclude that we should feed starving children and tell the truth unless we hold that saving lives and truth-telling are virtues. Since we all have virtues that guide our conduct, which we learn from our earliest years, we all engage moral questions. It would be a very simple world if we could always agree on values. But of course, disagreements occur. We encounter this in our personal lives as well as in the most far-reaching questions of public policy. When people disagree, there's rarely much need for emotional intensity if the dispute is only over matters of conditions of fact. The fire under such arguments arises when there are questions about values, such as justice and fairness. To resolve questions of value, or even just to make sense of these questions of conflict, we have to decide if what we're arguing about are mere social conventions or personal preferences, or if values have an objective basis in the world of experience. If we determine the basis of the argument is between so-called, let's say, family values and feminist values or humanistic values, or between progressive values and conservative values, have we reached an irreducible point in the conflict beyond which critical thinking cannot take us? Can only a political process resolve such a conflict? So, the first question of moral reasoning becomes, how can we establish which are the correct values? On what are values based? How are they verified and validated? In Plato's Euthyphro, Socrates asks if an action is good because it's beloved of the gods, or if it's beloved of the gods because it's good. If being good is a condition of being loved by the gods, then moral right ultimately is arbitrary and capricious. The Greek gods often quarreled and disagreed, and even if the question is framed with respect to a monotheistic God, if the good is only what God loves, God could always change his mind. This puts the theistic moralist in the awkward position of having to read God's mind. And this is a presumptuous task, since God does not have a radio show or a newspaper column. If, however, we accept the other horn of Socrates' dilemma, that the gods love an action because it is good, then we accept that the basis of goodness lies outside of God and is independent of God or the gods. This Socratic problem may seem dated to us. In fact, it seems carbon dated. But it's still relevant to the contemporary process of validating the correctness of our values. God-decreed values are of a type that we call deontological. This designates a school of ethics that hold that certain values or actions or rules of conduct or attributes of character are good in themselves. And there's no need to justify them further, and what's more, they cannot be justified further. That they are good is known, they claim, a priori. That is, prior to and independent of any experience. Sometimes these values are presented as prima facie rules of natural law. But I think that all deontological ethical systems fail because the values that are claimed cannot be validated. One naive usage that I hear at times is that homosexuality is wrong because it's self-evident, natural law, that the sexual function exists for reproduction, which can only be done with a male and a female. When I argue that it cannot be a natural law because homosexuality is widespread in the animal kingdom and occurs, I believe, in all mammalian species, I get a reply sometimes such as, well, just because animals do it, that doesn't mean that people have to do it too, does it? In other words, natural law is not something that we learn by observing nature, but a human concept that we impose upon nature to justify moral rules that are ultimately arbitrary. Sometimes encountered the argument that there must be a God because there is a moral order. The Christian debater William Lane Craig, for example, has posed it in this form. You'll give me a little latitude. We all know that genocide is wrong, don't we? Well, that proves that there's an absolute moral order. And if there are laws, absolute moral laws, then there must be a lawgiver. Now, I know there are people who sincerely believe that this argument works, but it really strikes me as just a silly trap for a debater playing to the audience. If the person debating them says that there are no God-given rules, moral absolutes, then he can respond indignantly. Do you mean that genocide isn't wrong? I'm outraged. Why, your relativism is justifying the Nazi Holocaust. As if a humanist or an atheist would be unable to find a reason to disapprove of the Holocaust. I'll mention one more deontological ethical system that is really of a different type, and that's Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. Kant tried to put moral reasoning on a rational footing by saying that we should always act in a way such that our specific action can be elevated to a universal rule. This is an interesting twist because he's not looking for a priori rules, but trying to generate universal rules by looking at specific concrete examples. Well, I think that the structural failing of Kant's system lies in the assumption that universality is anything but an arbitrary mental concept. For any action, one can come up with counterexamples in which the proper decision would be to violate the universal rule that we just created with the statute. For example, my friend Guido may come looking for me to see if I know where Casper is, because Casper owes him money. Now, I would probably tell him, making a universal rule that we should tell the truth and that we should help the pursuit of justice when we can. But if I feared that Guido might brutalize or kill Casper, I would lie instead. Now, I would say this situation does not follow the rules in the identical case, the nearly identical case, but instead I'm changing my action because I must protect people from harm. The point is that Kant's system does not really generate universal rules of conduct, but malleable and arbitrary justifications. If it's right to tell the truth in one case and lie in the other, then the reason is something other than universality. The alternative type of moral system to a deontological system is a teleological one, which decides moral good according to consequences. In the case of Guido and Casper, for example, whether I do the right thing has nothing at all to do with whether I tell the truth, which is a deontological value, but everything to do with whether the consequence is to save Casper from a beating. Now, it's funny that when I was growing up, one of the proverbs of colloquial wisdom that was drummed into me was is that what separated us from the godless Russian communists was that they hold that the end justifies the means. Now, that was a reflexive denunciation of teleological moral systems. They said that if the end justifies the means, then you can justify anything. Stalin could murder millions of peasants and thousands of intellectuals to send thousands of intellectuals to Siberian gulags because he was trying to create a workers' paradise. Now, that sort of objection presumes that the ends which justify an action are completely arbitrary, whatever you want them to be. Critics sometimes say that teleological systems, even specifically utilitarianism, just decide what is the most efficient way to reach a goal, but does not select or evaluate the goal itself. Now, I don't think that that's a valid objection. We digress for a moment to consider what morality is. Every human society establishes rules of conduct. Those standards, most primitively, constitute the society's moral foundation. But even though standard setting seems to be an imperative of our very social species, there's no content, no universal set of rules that's in any sense innate. From society to society, they vary enormously. What we can say at the most general level is that standard setting is a human evolutionary development that is of benefit to the species. Standard setting benefits the human community, even though the individuals must often sacrifice their immediate self-interest. At its greatest generality, then, I think that ethical systems are standards of conduct to benefit a society as a whole. I think that this most general of definitions leads us to a single principle that, I confess, may be categorized as a priori. That is the utilitarian principle that equates morally correct action with the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, I do not intend, by admitting that this principle is a priori, to absolve myself of having to examine it, validate it, and justify it. I merely admit that I cannot compel you to accept it as the guide for your actions, as a mathematician would be able to compel you to accept that 2 plus 2 equals 4, or a logician would be able to compel you to accept the validity of modus ponens. But I would like to propose a challenge to anyone who supports deontological ethical systems. When you insist that an action is right, even though it clearly results in harm, or propose as right an action although there's an alternative available that would clearly be less harmful, can you really assert that this deontological choice is right, even though it leads to consequential harm? Now, I'm sure that there are some people who would readily come up with examples, but I just think that those examples are scary, have scary implications. I've heard Martin Luther once said something to the effect that the world can go to smash, because God can always make new worlds. Now, that strikes me as the ultimate counter-consequentialist statement. We should act as God wants, even if what results is the death of everyone or destruction of the world. Luther apparently believed that consequences should play no part in moral valuation. Utilitarianism structures moral reasoning on a metaphor of a balance scale to decide if an action is good or bad. We look at its consequences to everyone affected. We have to determine the magnitude and dispersion of harm and the magnitude and dispersion of benefit and put them on opposing ends of a balance scale. If the scale tips towards benefit, then the action is good. And if the scale tips towards harm, then the action is bad. Utilitarianism resolves the objection that Stalin or Pol Pot justify their actions by their intended consequences. Intended consequences are not objective criteria for evaluating morals. Only actual consequences can evaluate actions. Even if we were to accept that their selected ends were credible rather than sociological myths, one cannot justify immediate, enormous harm to a great number of people in the hope of some distant reward. The only goal defined by utilitarianism is the greatest good for the greatest number. When utilizing that principle to determine one's action, one must not only determine that the intended outcome would represent a surplus of benefit over harm, but also the likelihood that the action under consideration would produce that outcome. We must balance, too, the likelihood of harmful consequences, whether recognized side effect of the intended action or an unintended consequence. Utilitarian moral reasoning requires risk assessment and risk management. With most of our daily actions, the consequences are direct, immediate, easy to foresee. In the case of social programs, however, the success is often determined by results years removed and are dependent upon the actions of a great many people, have many incidental consequences that affect a large number of people. And there are certain to be side effects that we cannot foresee. We cannot adopt the principle of do no harm, since, of course, there are worthwhile objectives that will require that some people make a sacrifice. But direct, intentional, massive harm cannot justify distant benefits of incalculable possibility. This points up a characteristic conservatism to consequential moral reasoning. Consequences determine whether our actions are good or bad. And yet we do not have crystal balls. When we act, we can never be certain we're doing right thing. This is very much in distinction to typical moral systems that, for example, theists might assert. Usually, once they decide that they've come across the appropriate rule, applicable rule, they feel certain that they've made the right decision. Consequences may turn out to be horrible, but they'll always just say, well, at least I did the right thing. As a consequentialist, however, you can only act upon reasoning from factual conditions to foreseeable results. Although he knows he will sometimes be wrong factually, he must obtain the best information possible upon which to base his decision. This means that education has surpassing moral importance. A person with no facts upon which to act, or who cannot interpret facts that are evident, is morally handicapped. Utilitarianism is often divided into two branches, act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Now, act utilitarianism is as I've described it, determining right and wrong by the magnitude and dispersion of benefit and harm. But some people object that humans aren't calculating machines. We can't be judging the consequences of every action we take. They say that we'd suffer from paralysis by analysis. Now, in rule utilitarianism, the moral enterprise is to determine which rules of conduct would result in the greatest good for the greatest number. And then the morally right thing to do is merely follow those rules. It seems to me that rule utilitarianism has a significant advantage over deontological systems. Deontological ethics begin with supposedly self-evident principles and take enormous deductive leaps to supposedly certain rules. This seems to me to be particularly characteristic of Catholic moral theologians. Catholic moralists begin with an observation that heterosexual intercourse has reproductive potential, to deduce that homosexuality and erotica must be suppressed, that contraceptives and divorce are to be forbidden, and that everyone must enter a lifelong monogamous relationship within strictly defined sexual roles, unless they're called to the cloth. In rule utilitarianism, at least, the validity of a rule is only dependent upon the consequences of applying that rule. Rules are not plucked out of the air during armchair musings, but learned by experience and amenable to testing and validation. But rules sometimes conflict, and no rule will lead to favorable consequences 100% of the time. Now, a rule that leads to good results 90% of the time would certainly be an excellent rule and one that we would usually follow without question. But even such a rule is going to be wrong 10% of the time. And under rule utilitarianism, are we required to follow a rule that only leads to favorable consequences 60% of the time? What about 51% of the time? It seems to me that rule utilitarianism abandons the foundation of consequentialism. It no longer decides the moral value of an action by its consequences, but instead determines it by adherence to rules. I think that derails moral reasoning from aspirations of objectivity. I think that we have to regard all moral rules merely as percentage shots. They can be effective guidelines for our action, mental shortcuts to help us decide the greatest possibility of surplus benefit over harm. But we must keep in mind that they are sometimes wrong. We are morally responsible for unfavorable consequences from applying what is usually a dependable moral rule, because they might be inapplicable or exceptional circumstances. Now, it's certainly possible to object that consequences alone are an unreasonable yardstick. That if this happens to be a rare case in which applying a good rule leads to a bad result, that I should not be blamed for what I cannot foresee. Well, I certainly don't think you should be jailed for it. But perhaps blame is an inappropriate concept to apply to moral error. Let's suppose that you see a teen boy fall through the ice in a lake and flail about helplessly. If you risk your own life to save the boy, you will be celebrated as a hero. But now let's suppose that the next day this boy wakes up, kills his parents, takes a few guns to school, kills dozens of fellow students and teachers before he takes the gun and kills himself. Now, according to objective consequences, I would have to say that you did the wrong thing. Had you not acted and let the boy drown, dozens of people would be alive. But all decisions are bounded by time, place, and available knowledge. You could not have anticipated this result. So doing the wrong thing that caused enormous harm was unavoidable. The act was wrong, but not morally instructive. If that summer you then came across the lake and saw another boy flailing in the water, and there's a flotation device in a tree, and you think to throw it to him, but don't, and the boy drowns. Now, you might be prosecuted for failing to save the boy's life. No one would accept as a defense that you let the boy die to prevent him from killing people the next day. Moral valuations, then, are always bounded by time, specific circumstances, and available knowledge. Any action that one performs, no matter how certain it seems to lead to favorable consequences, no matter how well intended, could always turn out to be wrong. The action is decided based upon facts available at one time, but evaluation may be changed by facts that become evident later. If we accept an objective basis for moral valuation, we have to surrender certainty. Another objection to the claim that moral reasoning can have an objective basis is that it is not a sufficient safeguard to say that the only fixed good is benefit, since I always make a subjective selection of what counts as benefit. I think this is a pretty substantial, pretty important objection, and one that we have to guard against. Indeed, it would be purely subjective to assert that what I see as a benefit for myself will be of great social benefit if it applies to a great number of people. This would make me the arbiter of social benefit and harm. To do it objectively, one would have to interview all the people involved. The survey that results by asking every person who was affected by the action, were you harmed or were you benefited? This summation would be a summation of subjectivity, but it represents, nevertheless, an objective evaluation. To appreciate this, you only have to look at political polls. Do political polls, which come up with a number dividing the electorate, Do they represent something objective, something that's real? Well, they're paid an awful lot of money, so I believe that you'd have to say there's some validity to it. Now, as atheists, of course, we do not believe in God-decreed morality, nor a morality based upon natural law. We don't think that can possibly be valid. Neither, however, do we accept subjectivism, that right is somehow whatever we want, nor unconditional cultural relativism that cannot distinguish between the value of social conventions of one country and another. Only by evaluating the morality of actions by their consequences in harm and benefit in people's lives can we establish an objective basis for moral decision-making. In other words, moral decision-making can never be objective if it's based upon arbitrary or a priori values that we cannot justify. The only objective basis for moral decision-making is consequences in harm and benefit in people's lives. These consequences are real. They happen in the objective world. They can be observed. They can be recorded and measured. We can establish magnitude and dispersion for them. And so, the application of morality to public policy as well as to individual personal action is a matter of observation, of always being willing to sacrifice one's own best interests for what one sees is the greatest good for the greatest number. There's a great deal more that I could go on to say about this topic, about the question of morality, and I hope that it's raised some interest in you, if you've given some thought about morality, about ethics, about how an ethical system can be constructed if there are no gods, if there is no God. And if you'd like some further information on this and other topics, you might be interested in contacting Minnesota Atheists. If you're interested in us, we're interested in you.